and welcome to Philosophy of X here on the Aspect Network. I'm your host, Alex Batts, and I'll be your guide as we take a journey to examine the world of X-Men through philosophy. So, last week I said that we had reached the end of our Interlude episodes, but as you can tell from the title of this episode, that was obviously not true. Today marks the almost official end of the Krakoan Era of X-Men comics with the release of Rise of the Powers of X number 5. There's just one more issue of the Krakoan Age left with X-Men number 700 next week, but I'm pretty sure that's just going to feel like mostly an epilogue issue, so I thought that now would be as good a time as any to dive into my thoughts on this final wave of Krakoan comics. Spoiler alert, this is kind of going to be a rant. On a more serious spoiler note, I will be talking broad strokes about the end of the Krakoan Era, so there will be some spoilers, but I'm going to try to avoid getting into any specifics. So if you're averse to knowing anything at all about how this era is wrapping up, be warned, but otherwise, carry on. And let's get into it, I guess. So, okay, I need to give some prefaces here. One, all of the creatives involved in this era are great. They're great comics creators. They've made some amazing books. I love them a lot, for the most part. It's just, okay, context. The Krakoan Era, I guess, started with the release of House of X and Powers of 10 in the summer of 2019, and that launched the Krakoan Age as we know it. And throughout the Krakoan Era, we had different waves of books and different eras that were titled different things. So like the first wave of books was known as like Dawn of X, and then we moved into Reign of X, and then Destiny of X, and then for the last like 8 or so months, I guess 8 or 9 months, we've now been in the Fall of X, which has been the last act, the last arc of the Krakoan Era. And then even more recently, in the last like 4 months, we've been into the very, very end because they announced 2 series, Fall of the House of X and Rise of the Powers of X, that were supposed to mirror in concept the start of Krakoa with House of X and Powers of 10. And already just based on that, they missed the ball with the fact that the beginning of the Krakoan Era was so strong and so good because you had these 2 series, you had House of X and you had Powers of 10. There were 2 6-issue miniseries that released for 12 weeks straight. There were no other X books coming out. It was just these 12 issues that dropped 12 weeks in a row, and it was like, hey, this is the jumping on point. This is setting up the new era. Right? It was super clean, and then spinning out of that, you had 6 launch titles, and then things went from there. With this end here, we've got Fall of the House of X and Rise of the Powers of X, also notably not Rise of the Powers of 10, whatever. And instead of one, there are 2 5-issue series, and they didn't release for 10 weeks back to back. They released monthly for 5 months, and had a bunch of other X titles also happening. Like we got Resurrection of Magneto, which was a 3-issue miniseries. We got X-Men Forever, which was a 4-issue miniseries that really integrally tied into Rise of the Powers of X. And so you had all of these other things happening on top of the regular X-Men book still shipping, on top of the Wolverine book still shipping. And so it just made this end both incredibly drawn out, but then also incredibly compressed. It's this really, really weird thing that has happened where the end of the Krakoan Era has been unbelievably rushed, but also drawn out at the same time. And it's I don't understand how that's a thing that happened, but in the story itself, you can feel the story beats, the long things that have been gestating and planted for years just being compressed down into these 10 issues, mostly with Fall and Rise. And then you also have X-Men Forever, which is essentially 4 more issues of Kieran Gillen's Immortal X-Men, and then that ties into Rise of the Powers of X. And it's just this weird thing where like it doesn't at all make any sense structurally. It does, but at the same time it's so compressed and so not handled well. Like these creatives were just not put in a position to do something great with this. And so that's why at the top I wanted to say that like these are great creators. Like they're all working with Marvel for a reason, right? Like they have their positions because they should, right? But then when you put them in the type of rushed, very obviously editorial forced mandate, because if you don't know, there is a relaunch of the X-Men line coming after this. It will start in the summer, and it's very much a back to basics. There's no Krakoa anymore. It's the X-Men on the run in a couple of teams, and they're hated and feared by the world again, and it's a retread of stories that we feel like we have seen countless times because we have seen them countless times. And so the end of this era has felt very much like you have to put all of the toys back in the box. All of the concepts and ideas that were super interesting and intriguing from Krakoa can't be around anymore because we need to go back to how things felt before Krakoa. And the reason that that is so jarring is because Krakoa was so game-changing for mutants and for what you could do with X-Men stories. And listen, that's not to say that Krakoa didn't have faults. Right, it was not perfect. The way that the line was run was not perfect. There's a lot of arguments and discussion to be had that things totally went off the rails, or that a vision was lost whenever Hickman departed with Inferno. You can argue about that all day long. There's good books, there's bad books in it, but on the whole, it was something so fresh and unique that offered so many different opportunities, and now all of that is being rushed to a close for what is hard to not feel like the sake of corporate synergy, because we know that an X-Men movie is coming with the MCU, and so they want the MCU X-Men to reflect what's going to be happening in the comics, and in order to do that, the comics can't be doing Krakoa anymore. That's just what it feels, and that's very pessimistic. Maybe that's not the case, but it feels hard not to feel that way. And so it's this weird thing where, like, I don't know. I mean, one, I'll say Fall of the House of X just did not, as a series, did not land at all. It was bafflingly rushed, written poorly, and it sucks because Jerry Duggan, who was the writer for that series, is a great writer. I love his Marauders stuff. I love the majority of his X-Men run. I thought was great. There's some misses, of course. No one's going to have a perfect track record, but he can write great comics. Fall of the House of X was not a great comic. Kieran Gillen, who penned Immortal X-Men, which is arguably my favorite book of the entire Krakoan era. He was the writer for Rise of the Powers of X and X-Men Forever. I loved most of X-Men Forever. I also absolutely loved most of Rise of the Powers of X. I think that it was doing a great job at picking up some of the major plot threads and the major themes and ideas that were presented at the beginning of this era and wrapping them up as satisfyingly as you could in the amount of time given. But even still, like, issue 5 of that series came out today, and it's the most frustrating. Kieran Gillen is my favorite comics writer currently working, and reading Rise of the Powers of X number 5 is the most frustrated I have ever felt reading a Kieran Gillen comic. And that's not to say that it was a bad comic, but a fantastic writer can still only do so much in a bad situation, and this just feels like a bad situation. There wasn't the time, and it also feels like the definition of make sure you put literally all of the toys back in the box so that we can have a fresh start here. And that's not to say there's not good moments in the issue, and there's not to say that there's not also exciting ideas that are going to be coming in these relaunched books, despite how, as you can tell, I am very obviously a huge proponent of Krakoa. I wanted this era to last for 10, 15, 20 years. I think there are so many exciting storytelling opportunities that you could do here. I do think that some of the things that we're seeing from what is going to be this relaunched X-Men are exciting and are good directions. I think the talent on board these titles is amazing. The diversity on board these new titles is amazing, and something the back half of the Krakoan era absolutely lacked. And so that's important to see, and so that is good. But when looking specifically at the way that this Fall of X, these last titles for the Krakoan era have been handled, it's nothing short of disappointing. Like, it's the most, it hurts, and it's not. And people who have been in comics for a long time will be like, oh yeah, that's just what's going to happen with your favorite properties. They're going to get relaunched, or they're going to get taken in a direction that you hate, and things like that. And like, it's just part of the game. And it is just part of the game. And it sucks. But at the same time, I feel like okay to be upset about that. I mean, like, I have the Krakoan flower tattooed on my hand. Like, these books really did changed a big part of my life and got me really invested in comics again, and are the reason I fell in love with the X-Men. The Krakoan Era is the reason this podcast exists. I would not be doing an X-Men podcast. I would not be this into these characters if I hadn't been pulled in with House of X and Powers of 10. And so to see the end of the era so fumbled and rushed for what feels like no real reason, just because Marvel decided that they had to rush it to an end, sucks. It doesn't make sense. It's just a huge bummer. I think, I don't know. I mean, like I said, there's some things that I enjoyed, like Rise of the Powers of X. Killen did some great work in a majority of it. X-Men Forever was awesome. I think the stuff that we got with Hope was really cool, albeit some of the stuff is also a little disappointing in that regard. I don't want to get into, again, story-specific details with all of this, because I do think, even with this ending, that the Krakoan Era is definitely worth exploring. It's worth checking out. It's worth reading, especially the beginning stuff. House of X and Powers of 10 is already going down and will go down as one of the evergreen comics in comics history. It's incredible, and I think that there's a lot of worthwhile stories throughout the entirety of the era, except for most of Fall of X, honestly. I mean, like, the end of Immortal X-Men and X-Men Red are fantastic. Resurrection of Magneto is one of the best miniseries that I've read. It was great. It was a 4-issue series, by the way. I think I said 3 earlier, but it was 4. It was incredible. Some of the best character exploration for both Storm and Magneto that you can find. Al Ewing really gets those characters. But just on the whole, like, the titles that populated the Fall of X wave, and then the titles that punctuated the end of the Fall of X wave, are just, they leave a lot to be desired. They leave a very sour taste in my mouth, unfortunately, and it's a bummer. I wish they were better. Honestly, I wish that we weren't rushing to this end, obviously, but we're here. They're out. We have one more issue with X-Men 700, which will be an oversized issue. It's X-Men Legacy 700. I think it's X-Men, I don't even remember what the issue number is for this run in the title. I want to say 35, but that, I feel like I might be conflating that with Batman 135 or something like that. But either way, we have one more issue technically left in the Krakoan Era. It's this big anniversary 700 issue, and so we'll see how everything gets fully wrapped up, how they tie all these bows together and lead into the relaunch. But yeah, that's those are my thoughts, I guess. I'm just a little bit bummed and kind of wanted to talk about it a little bit. I have a X-Men podcast, so that's an outlet for me to do so. But yeah, it's I don't know. Conflicted, disappointed, wish it was a little bit better. There's definitely still some gems and some great stuff in there. And again, these creatives they're great creatives. I know this is very much going to sound like I'm super down on them, but I do think that they are very talented individuals. And so that's kind of what makes it hurt a little bit more that these comics are not better. But yeah, I guess that's it. That's my reaction, rant, ramble about the Fall of X and the end of the Krakoan Era. So yeah, thank you so much for tuning into this interlude episode of Philosophy of X, and be sure to bring your psychic blocking metal helmet, as next week we dive into the competing ideologies of Magneto and Charles Xavier through the lens of utilitarianism and deontology. You can find me online at APBatman with 2 T's, and please be sure to subscribe here to The Aspect on YouTube and any platform where podcasts can be found. Please give us a like, leave a comment, and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. You can also follow us on Twitter/X, Instagram, and TikTok at The Aspect Co. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.